Okay, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience. We've had a really full and beautiful day, and the session on the stage has run over. But it's such a beautiful session, we just couldn't stop everyone mid-sentence. So we've let them carry on with their music videos, and people are moving over here for the session. I'm really, really excited about this afternoon and the last sort of talk of Saturday. It's been a beautiful, slow, caring, collective day, which is exactly the right mode for Mark and Soraya and Indy to come in. And the reason why I was going to say that is Mark's one of the most thoughtful, caring leaders I've ever come across. And every time we bump into each other, he'll be the one who's in the country, and he'll check on me and check if I want to go to dinner and check if I need anything. And I've always just been super inspired. So that's what kicked off this conversation. And then Mark suggested that we join it up with Indy and Soraya. And so really looking forward to having a great convo today. So the title of the session is Urban Development Meets Human Development. So designing cities for human potential. And the description that we talk about and Mark put together for the session is Civic Square and the new Medina are two initiatives reimagining how neighbourhoods are built and work. While separated by land and sea, one is in the UK, Birmingham, Britain, and the other in Northern Africa, in Tunisia. Each is tackling the challenges of post-industrialization, urban sprawl world. Can heritage drive development versus being replaced by it? How can belonging be a design priority in architecture? And what does a child inclusive city look like? What about elder inclusive? And so we're going to have a chat about this now. And Indy seems to have dropped off, but I'm sure he'll be back. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more. And what I'm hoping is to talk less, and Indy and Mark are going to sort of take over looking after the session more. But I was wondering whether, rather than me read out all your bios, which is always a bit weird in real life and in virtually, whether it'd be nice for everyone to go around and introduce themselves. That would be fab. So maybe we could start with Mark whilst Indy's sorting out his technology. Mark, I'm sorry, we can't hear you. Are you muted?
Yes, so my name is Mark Gonzales. I'm a futurist and a connector. I have the privilege, I'm not sure if everyone's rearranged the same way on my screen with Soraya Hosni above me, but I have the privilege of being married to the person above me with the tiles in her background, and having two children together as well, ages 2 and 5.5. And the reason I share that is because I think it'll drive a lot of our conversation, which is our work and our family are not things that are separate. They're things that are connected to one another, and the design challenges that we tackle, whether from a structural space or a personal space, are very much linked to the world we want to live in and the world we want to leave behind for our little ones. And these are not things that are abstract or afterthoughts. They're an integral part of everything we do. And so in that reintegration, I think I'll just center that is that's who I am.
Amazing. Soraya, would you like to share next as we just wait for Indy to come back in?
Yes. So I'm Soraya Hosni, and I'm an anthropologist. I'm French-Tunisian, Tunisian-French, and I am passionate about communities and well-being, heritage, and overall just connectivity between humans and nature.
Amazing. Indy, can you, okay, brilliant. Indy, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Hi, delighted to be here. My name is Indy Johar. I'm one of the people. Also, was one of the co-founders. I'm one of the co-founders of 00, which was behind WikiHouse, Open Desk, and multiple impact hubs. Was part of the team which helped support part of the co-founding team of Impact Hub Birmingham a long time ago now. And it's great to see that kind of having evolved into so many amazing things like Civic Square. So yeah, delighted to be here.
Amazing. So basically, we've got a for the session. I'm going to introduce myself in a second, not just the person who's trying to make the whole session work and the whole festival work, which has distracted me slightly this afternoon, because everything, and so that's what I'm going to share. Everything that could go wrong in succession after 3 very successful days went wrong. So I come into this a bit flustered. I'm glad I'm not talking first, because I'm going to ground myself and actually listen to the others and then talk. But Imi here, and I'm one of the co-founders of Civic Square. Previous to Civic Square, we were running Impact Hub Birmingham, which Indy just talked about. And through that journey and through meeting Indy and through our work together, I guess the things I've been interested by are civic and social infrastructure and the role it plays in our cities and our neighborhoods and so on. And so I'm at the stage of like closing down Impact Hub Birmingham at the end of last year, which was a long process, and sort of birthing this new transition, this new era. And so I'm looking forward to talking a little bit about that as me later on. But for now, we've got kind of sort of 4 parts to this, which is Mark's going to open up with looking at what is time, is it on clock of the world, and what is time, and Soraya and I are going to talk a bit about our initiatives and our space and the work that we're doing, and then Indy's going to talk a little bit more about future gazing, and then we're going to have a bit of a conversation at the end where you'll be able to ask questions, so ask them as we go along. But for now, I'm going to hand over to you, Mark.
Thank you. So the sit on the clock of the world actually comes from one of the great social intellectuals of the 20th century, Grace Lee Boggs, Chinese-American, brilliant woman who lived at the age of about 103 and passed away in Detroit. And those of us who used to sit with her in the late 90s, mid 2000s, she would ask that question whenever we would sit down, and she would frame it in a very important way. And the reason I do that is to kind of tee up why I think the new Medina and the Civic Square are so important, not only to the cities and the families and the communities they're trying to serve, but a world that is desperately out of balance, that is trying to find new models and new sources of wisdom and inspiration to turn to. Grace used to basically share with us when we'd sit down about the 3 stages of human existence, from hunting and gathering, which took about 100,000 years of Homo sapiens life, to agriculture, which completely rechanged how human beings would organize, not only each other or identity, but their entire societies, being able to build cities, infrastructure, and how that itself began to take another about 10 to 20,000 year transition as a predominant model. And then around the kind of 1700s, the Industrial Revolution coming, and once again, rapidly changing the human landscape, and for, some would argue for the first time, the planetary landscape as well. And so she began centering with us that what we were experiencing in 05 and 06 was the end of the Industrial Revolution, and that most every city in the world awaiting what happened to Detroit, which was an outflux of business, a decline in what the world called value, and leftover people who were trying to remake space and remake relationship in the midst of having heritage and other things taken from them. In some ways, we've seen that challenge grow across the planet. And for me, that's what I see Civic Square and the new Medina tackling. One in the UNESCO World Heritage Medina of Sousse, a World Heritage Medina basically translating as an old city, but what used to actually be the new city in the 600s, 700s, and 800s, a model for development in neighborhoods that connected people, that had sacred space, that had resident space, that had market, that had a souk. And the civic square, that's also trying to look at that same thing. Both of us living in cities, even though they're on different continents, that have suffered under the suburban development model and suburban sprawl, which atomized people, and also fragmented, to your point of elder inclusive, it fragmented generations. And I think it's something to lift up very importantly with the generation risk we are in of under COVID, of the world quite likely was under the possibility of losing perhaps 30 to 40% of all elders within 24 months. We were facing that. And can we hold these models or these challenges up to really say, what type of neighborhood do we want to live in? What are the ways we build them? Can we build not just buildings, but spaces for connection, convening, and what Soraya Hosni, always lifts up kinship? And I will stop rambling at that point and pass it over to the two brilliant people who should be speaking, which is Soraya and Imandi.
Soraya, would you like to go first? I think that would be that'd be good.
Well, thank you. I'm very pleased to be sitting here in conversation with you all today and speaking about the theme that I'm very passionate about. And when we say urban development meet human development, really it's about like where do we live and how do we live with one another, and what buildings and community shape is how we interact on a daily basis, and how do space answer our need. And while like every place has an imprint of what that feels like and what you see and what you smell across the world, you can see all kinds of models. One thing that for me was very clear is that we see a lot of models being replicated around the world, but it's like it's unidirectional. Like everywhere around the world, you see new development, villas, and I'm not an architect, so I don't know the exact terms for these type of developments, but it's suburban, urban development, and you see that spread out all across the world. Just a generation ago in Tunisia, if you went to the island of Jerba and you took a picture, you would recognize you're in Jerba. If you went to Tozeur and took a picture of the houses in Tozeur, you would recognize immediately that you're in Tozeur. And same thing for Sidi Bou Said and Sousse, and every place in the country had their specific architectural imprint. And that translates in which bricks we use, which colors we put on the wall. Just by a picture, you can recognize where you are. Nowadays, if you take a picture of a house in those same cities, they all look alike. You can't identify the space just by how facade looks like. And obviously, it's not just about facade, because in the South, if the houses were underground, it's because, it's desert and it was cool and it was the most appropriate way to actually live if there was a sandstorm. And it's the same for the Medina here in Sousse. The houses were self-sustaining, and I had the chance to live the confinement months, like 3 months inside the house, and I kept telling myself, like, if I was living that same time in an apartment, my experience would have been very different just by the design of the house. In the house, we have rooftops, we have courtyards, we see birds coming in, and we're in and out, and even if we couldn't go outside in the street, we're still outside, we're still enjoying being outside. So putting all this together, it's like meeting the anthropologist in me and the passion for seeing people connecting in a mindful way. We had to do something because Sousse is my hometown and the Medina is abandoned. And why is that model of development, urban development, abandoned today? Why is it not regarded as something that actually can be, one, uplifted, and second, shared even? not just like for us, but for other models. Why don't we take from places where actually cities and houses were designed in a way that was inclusive, that was eco-friendly, that was sustaining all these elements that make up for Islamic architecture and so many other indigenous ways of building, like villages and towns. It's not just here, but the attributes that we have here are really like powerful and beautiful, and they make up for a healthy living with the urban development. So when you see that it doesn't happen, it doesn't exist, and it's abandoned, and you see the effect on the community, there is no place for children, that goods are no longer local, and all this stuff that was before a no-brainer, it shifted, and you see the effect of it. Then, you know, we ask ourselves, like, what's our responsibility? What can we do? Because it was just like a generation ago. Can we just like come back to a way that meets our challenges and needs of today and source in the ideas of the past? So, you know, that's a long intro, but it's putting like, why are we doing this, you know?
So I think, yeah, I that was very great. Thank you, Mark and Sarai, for going first, because I needed to ground myself out of being running the festival and back as Imi. So I think our starting point was, it was quite different to the experience that Soraya just explained. And our reason to continue has been for reasons that I'll share, but are a bit more technical, and it's unusual because I definitely came to this full of heart. So in 2012, when I first met Indy, I was working in a housing association, and I was frustrated with the model of local development. I had come out of the international development world, and I remember having a conversation with Mark around this when he was last in Birmingham. I'd kind of just had enough of it, in the sense that I couldn't figure out what it was trying to achieve. And I think the quicker I was trying to unlearn my education and looking at the colonial roots of the impact of Britain, I was starting to understand even more on the rest of the world. I was starting to understand even more that, especially in the international development space, that there was so many like harmful structures being recreated and like industries being propped up, even though they were masquerading as like NGOs or social organizations. And so it was actually quite, I never had any plans to do this work. I never thought this is where I'd end up. And I'm sharing that because that was not due to a lack of imagination or actually, no. Yeah, it wasn't to do with a lack of imagination or ambition of what I thought we could achieve. It was more to do with this had never really come in my frame of reference when I was at school. Like, we were never taught that you can build your places, or the future is yours to create, or you shape your cities, your cities shape you. Like, these things were never like even talked about. So I just had a very like straightforward understanding of like, well, if I went into one of those industries, then maybe that would be my job. But if I didn't, well, then that's the end of that, really. But I found myself volunteering with the TEDx in Birmingham in 2013. And it's really good to talk about this here, because there's a link which I will get to in a second. But in 2012, when I started that, and in 2013, when I met Indy, Indy walked into one of the TEDx's and he'd said, he was just like, "Do you understand what you're doing here?" And, you know, I remember him coming into one of the conferences, into the conference day, and saying, "Oh, I'm here, like I've come, because I'd invited him, and he was like, he was like, have you got time for a coffee? And about 10 minutes before this, Indy was like, oh yeah, this panel's at 5 o'clock, isn't it? And it reminded me of 2013, because I was like, I'm in the middle of running this huge festival and you're asking if I've got time for a coffee in the middle of the main day. And just before this, he'd asked me just really casually, you know, something. And I was thinking, yeah, I'm in the middle of running a huge online festival. We might not have time for this conversation. But all in short, that moment, that one moment where he had said, do you understand what you're doing here and the power of what you're convening? And in all honesty, no, I had no idea. We were just a bunch of kids a bit fed up with our city, and we were starting to bring people together. And the reason why I'm bringing that bit of the story up is because we're still a bunch of awkward teenage kids that are a lot older but like to think we're still kids. And what we're doing is we're convening, right? And that's because one of the things I've realized over the last 7 or 8 years is the power of convening, and why it's so important in these times, especially around deliberation, out how we move through uncertain and complex and strange times. So that's where we started, right? And from that event, we wanted to create a space. I didn't really know anything about spaces. Indy had introduced me to the Impact Hub network. It was full of incredible leaders. And so we started there. But when we went into it, and this is the crux point of what leads to Civic Square, really, because everything else is beautiful and lovely, and we're in community together, and it feels good and it's wonderful. And I love connecting with you all, and this stuff makes me feel great, and the hub was beautiful, but that is not why I'm doing the work anymore. And I'll be really clear on that, because I can have that in my family. I'm very lucky to come from a big family. I'm very lucky to have had very good friends when I was younger, and could be in community with lots of different people. I come from a Sikh community that is bubbling, full of incredible networks, and I don't feel any lack of community. And the 5 years of doing the hub was beautiful. I mean, you can still go to the website. We did everything from centering children to looking at housing, to trying to break the business model, to making this bustling, beautiful venue work. We had thousands of people through the door. We had events from poetry to system change, massive labs, to art and creativity, decolonial festivals. It was, I mean, if I had just stopped there and looked back on that, I could have been so proud of why I did that. Every single day was full of love and care and pain of being an entrepreneur. It was full of pain. Mark often helped me with that when he came to Birmingham. But the reason why we're doing Civic Square, so we closed the hub, for those of you who don't know, we closed the hub at the end of 2019, isn't because I wanted more of that community. I want other people to experience it, of course. It's because Indy and then the work that we did through Impact Hub taught me one really important thing. None of this work in the UK can thrive until we deal with some of the underlying issues. And I'm sure Indy will talk about that a bit more. So land ownership, building ownership, ownership of the asset, figuring out the business model, figuring out what the finance really looks like. And we can talk about that in both practical ways and like really bold ways through some of the work that Indy might talk about through the Smart Commons work with Dark Matter. I have to talk to everyone in the audience who's watching today about why this doesn't work, because the last 3 days have been full of talks about why the land economy is broken, why social and civic infrastructure is struggling, and so on and so on. And the reason why I've brought this provocation to this room is because I think it's the opposite to what people are going to think I'm going to say, right? Because when you see me and you see our work, it's full of love, it's full of community, it's full of the power of convening and coming together. And we absolutely are looking to do that at Civic Square. If you look on the website, you'll see a public square is at the heart of what we're trying to create. But actually the reason for carrying on this work that is so, so tough isn't because I need loads of that lovely stuff, because I'd just happily come and participate in other people's community if honest. I could come to Tunisia, I could go to, you know, hundreds of projects all over the place, I could go to my family. It's actually because in order to make these things work, there's some key things that we need to figure out around finance, what we value, ownership, and how what lessons can we take from history about how places were organized, whether that's like parishes or how churches were renovated and looked after, or how parks were put into public ownership. Like, how do we create things that go to what Roman talked about last night in his talk, how to be a good ancestor, that, like, I don't have children, but say like my nephew's grandchildren could be like, oh yeah, somebody in this time made decisions that meant this public square is ours and it's thriving and it's something that we can do something powerful with. And then there's all sorts of other bits, right, around the climate crisis, around who's involved in urban development, what views and stories and cultures and traditions do we value and are we listening to? So there is all of that as well. But I wanted to kind of come with a bit of punchiness to say I'm not doing the work because of actually the things that it might seem like I'm doing it for, because this stuff is actually the easy stuff, how we come together. Humans are here for that. It's how we deal with all the crappy systems that we've created and how we try and show new versions of that whilst living in the old system that I'm really interested in. So that's why I'm here. And I think it sounds less inspiring when I say it like that, but that is actually the honest truth of it. Indy, I think we're going to you, aren't we? You look like you're just relaxing and
I am. So I suppose, yeah, no, I hear you guys, and I probably concur that this, in line with what I said yesterday, I think the scale of change that we're about to witness is of an order, and I think we're just beginning that change. And I think certain places around the world were already feeling it, maybe years before, but certainly now increasingly all over the world, we are starting to feel it. And I think whether we look at COVID or whether we look at any of these things, and I love the example of Detroit being the future of pretty much all cities. I think that's a pretty interesting analogy of where we're currently headed. And that requires deep change and it requires structural change. But also that change cannot be done at the center abstractly. It can't be done in the hallowed halls of Whitehall, because the reality is the complexity has to be built with small realities on the ground. So it has to be rich on the ground. So there's something interesting about having to work simultaneously on the ground, but deeply as well. So it's how do we do things which are driving, it's not just about planting a tree, it's about re-understanding what the tree means. And not just us re-understanding it, but actually communities re-understanding it. And then re-understanding not just communities, but actually into our legal codes, into our accounting codes. So we need to do things which actually have ripple effects into the structures of our society. We have to re-understand what it means to employ people. We have to re-understand what it means. Is it employment? Is it recruitment? This language of power and control has to be challenged. And that won't be challenged at the top. It has to be challenged every day in the reality of what we're doing on the ground. And I think, and when you get to the ground, I think what becomes interesting is the solutions aren't programmatic. It's not like we need a housing solution and then we need an employment solution and we need a retail solution, which is how you look at the problem from the center. But actually on the ground, these problems are integrated. These problems emerge differently. These problems respond differently. So what I find, revolutionary about what both of you are doing, I think sort of both the Medina project and also the kind of Civic Square, is that I think you have the capacity to reimagine not only it, but actually the probes and the structures that sit behind it. And in a way, Soraya, Mark, when we spoke yesterday, that was the part that I found really powerful, is that we have to use these things to change the deep codes and systems. And if we can do that, That's the real project. And I think that's what unleashes humans from not being agents of transaction, but actually agents of care. And at that moment in time, Imi, your thesis about the reality of building community as a natural act, well, we release that natural act so that we don't reduce every relationship to being an agent relationship of transactions. So I think you're right to say that, and I think we're increasingly going to have to rebuild this future at an integrated level on the ground whilst keeping our eye on the stars. I think it's got to have to be both, and that requires really complex skills, really complex capabilities, and the ability to have difficult, complex conversations. And what I want to say about that last bit is that I'm often frustrated in groups when they say, "Oh, Indy, what you're saying is so. Could you just make it simpler to understand? Could you communicate it more simply? Could you speak in?" And I was like, "No. This is not a problem of communication. It's a problem of dialogue. And in dialogue, it's empathy that matters more than the words that you use. In dialogue, it's the ability to be discursive about the issue that matters more than actually what words that you use. And we need to use complex words or the appropriate words to describe the appropriate problems. And we mustn't shy away from complexity because we're not trying to publish a 2-page document which will be understood by the world. We're trying to be involved in a conversation that needs to be built with the community, and the words will be understood. I've never found complex conversations difficult in communities. What I found is complex communication is always difficult with communities. And I think we have to differentiate between whether something is communication or whether it's genuinely a conversation. And I think this is going to be a real issue of how we build genuine conversations which allow us to reach the reality on the ground, but also the deep structures that sit around us. And that's going to require us to build a new type of respect for each other, which I think, in a way, I would argue this festival has. This festival has spanned, whether it's actually talking about music, art, culture, all the way through to talking about actually some of the kind of issues that Alistair raised yesterday about the kind of theory of land in our world. And I think we have to be able to understand and respect people's capability to do that. And that's going to be, I think, a key quick issue of how we grow this conversation.
Thanks, Indy. Okay, so Mark, I'm going to hand back over to you. And I think what we're going to do now is kick off a bit of an open conversation. But I think, Mark, you were far too humble when you started talking. So, and only shared a small little bit of you. So talk a little bit more, and then let's we're going to just have an open conversation. And if you're watching, I can see there's quite a lot of you watching. Start sharing questions, right? Because let's turn this into an open conversation about why are we doing this work? And if you want to find out more about the project as well, please ask questions. But yeah, Mark and go on Indy first, and then back to Mark.
Amy, what I was going to suggest was that what I find interesting about both your projects is that you're trying to build neighborhood infrastructure. And Soraya, from what I understand, you're going quite deep into the kind of underpinnings of this as well as the infrastructure. So maybe it would be great to get a little bit of reflection on that conversation and why that's important, why that's critical, and what challenges that brings. And that would be really interesting just to hear. I think everyone would be interested in hearing about that.
Absolutely. Soraya, would you like to go first?
So for us, I grew up in Paris, so there the needs and the has its own medicine. So for this place that's my motherland, we envisioned a medicine that fits the people and the place. And while we are a nation in construction, because everything in how we manage politics and institutions is in the making now, especially since the revolution in Tunisia. But there's so many structural changes happening right now, and those are slow processes, and they're going in the right direction, and there's a lot of influence of good thought leaders in those spaces. For us, it was important to focus on a city and on a closed space, and how can we affect culture, urban development, people's need, and at the same time policy. So it's really like looking at all the faces of the problem. On what you see is a city that has a downtown that's abandoned. You see the potential when you're a dreamer, and when you can compare, like you see the potential of the people and the city. And what's clear is that it's owned by the people of the place. There is no challenge of, I shouldn't say there is no, but it's not as big of a challenge of land ownership in Tunisia, because like almost 80% of the people own their houses. And now with COVID, what we realized is that we each have a relationship to the land as well. Like if it's not you who has farmland, it's your neighbor. Like you will find how to find food. It's not as big of a problem as like other places. So we don't need to focus so much on these things that could be improved, but not as big of a problem. What is clear is how we utilize the public space, and is it a space that's interactive, that's responding to the people's need, and people taking care of it. And it's obvious that it's not the case. But so our process was like, why? Why is the space not answering the needs and people not caring for it? You know, and then you start going as like step by step and thinking, what could be the most appropriate answer? And for us, it meant reestablishing people care for the space, for the public space, and not feeling this like fear of like public power, of like, I can't touch it, I can't do anything with it, it's not mine. So there's definitely that sentiment in the relationship with public space. But at the same time, it doesn't matter if I trash it, and there is no consequences. So it's a very interesting relationship. If you go to Europe or other places, if you do something on somebody's house, you might, like a graffiti or I don't know, stuff like, there is consequences on how you, or if you litter, you'll get a fine, or at least there's a sign that says you'll get a fine, maybe you'll get it, maybe not. But in Tunisia, you don't have that principle doesn't exist. So anyway, I don't know, that's what we're trying to answer by specific actions. But if there's questions, it might be easier to give more details on what's interesting for everyone.
Maybe if I could add something that you've shared. So I think it came up in our conversations yesterday with Indy, and there's two premises to me that drive Saraya's work. And I think of it from a systems designer standpoint, which is one, and I'd merge both Saraya and Indy into this, which is that we are living in a time of commodified economies that looks at everything from a space of selling. And as our conversation was yesterday, how do we move from an economy of a commodification to an economy of kinship? And that is at the core of, to me, Saraya's work around the globe, both as a polyglot, as a language preservationist, and as a person who's worked in purpose-driven economies. The other part I would kind of premise is Tunisia's GDP is 20% tourism. Most of the tourism is built on the mass model of tourism, of selling an illusion of a country to someone else coming for a short amount of time. As we know, that is not eco-sustainable in terms of the amount of water tourists use in order to create their lawns and their ponds at the hotel. It damages the local economy because it becomes kind of very import-export driven. And that what Saraya also presents is a model of economy that looks at how do you love where you live and throw great parties, and that equals more guests. And I think that's an important dynamic because it doesn't argue there's a tourist or there's not a tourist. It's about loving and creating a deep relationship with where you are, and creating spaces that celebrate who you are, and then expanding your relationship and your kinship with the world from that standpoint. And then that builds the economy. And I think that, to me, is at the core of what the New Medina is looking at, which is how do we create off-ramps for our existing livelihood measures, and do so in a way that doesn't just throw people's lives into disarray, but gives them a deeper sense of self in place that then begins to create an on-ramp to something that we all don't know what quite is yet, but at least we have kind of a North Star direction to move in.
Mark, just to build on that, I mean, you work globally, and so does Soraya, right? So are you using your global economy to effectively rebuild the urban block, right? This is a kind of new reverse globalism, right? How you bring the global to the local. So you're using an economic thesis here, which brings the two together.
So,
and also one other thing is, it'd be great for you to describe, because when you spoke, you also described the scale of the block, right? It's a whole piece of city, which is pretty extraordinary, which I think people will fully understand unless you go through that. Great.
Go ahead, Samay.
Yeah, I can answer the first part of the question. So for me, what I found really powerful is learning from local experiences across the world that enables me to see more what's the specificity of the place that I am in, and see with the eyes of another lens, another perspective, and see it in a way that the people who live in it every day don't necessarily see or have forgotten. So that ability to be inspired from essence of structures, institutions, like we shared quickly about the legal system, and how if you learn from like South Pacific way of giving justice to the community, you realize that actually those mechanisms can exist in your own community and maybe existed before and can be reactivated. And that's that process of reactivation that is enabled for me from the global lens.
And then so to answer the second part of the question, and just really quickly touch on the first part, the way that I think about it is that all our models and frames are outdated and in need of an upgrade. And part of that is the way in which the world is a dialectic. There's a global and there's a local. And I think we always bring up our family, which is I have Mexican, Indigenous, and French heritage, an American passport. Soraya is born and raised in very much French and has a Tunisian passport and speaks 8 languages. And we have a 5-year-old who speaks 4 languages and has 3 passports, and a 2-year-old who is learning 3 languages at the same time. Where is home and what is local for them? And I think part of that is why I say the frames and the models is that I think that we're really entering this stage of saying that we talk about the future of work and the future of tech, that we really need to have a conversation on the future of identity and the future of home. And I think that will drive and make clear some of these tools and instruments that we're all developing, which direction we should point them in. Part of that for us was then, okay, well, we are committed to our homes. Home is not singular, home is plural for our generation. For us then, it's like, okay, home is where my dad is in Oregon. Home is where Soraya's grandmother is, which is here in Sousse in Tunisia. And we're like, okay, well, we know we give here to this home, this home. What do we give to this part of our home? And for us, we're like, well, we don't want home and heritage to be something that this is where we came from. It's like, it's also, you know, spiral. It's like, and this is an integral part of us. And so with that, we began saying in the future, we'd like to own a place here. And then in that conversation, someone presented, I think I have a space for you. And that was actually Soraya's sister who was walking around the Medina. And then Soraya's like, come see it. And I was like, this isn't a house, this is a block. what are we going to do with the blocks, Soraya? And then that became, well, what would we do with the block? You know, and so we didn't say no. We just actually sat, and you know, in our tradition, you know, as Muslims and as people who believe in the sacred, we sat, you know, and we consulted elders and we consulted angels and ourselves and said, okay, you know, is this about a leap of faith or not? And we said it is a leap of faith. And so we ended up, going to your point, Emmy, is that we ended up starting with asset ownership and saying that this is not something we're going to do from a leasing perspective, but actually direct investment in. And then from that space, talk about, okay, what do we want to begin to move out? And looking not just as the space is modular, but looking at the Medina itself is modular, and beginning kind of asset mapping from a different perspective.
Really interesting as well from what Soraya said, where the ownership piece is not something that's a huge challenge there, but other things like how you then treat your shared spaces and things like that is something that's quite different, which is fascinating, because I kind of like the idea of getting people to love their places more, compared to where we're at with like trying to. So our situation, this public square exists, and this block of buildings exists, and everything, whether it would be where we're based in the neighborhood in Birmingham, or whether it would be we want to go somewhere else, the route to doing that work is such a battle, because without ownership or long stewardship over a place, you know, the battle before that, getting to that time is so large that you know, once you get to it, you know, then you've actually got the work to do as well. And I think that that's interesting, because we're just in the helm of private developers and private developers and landlords and developers and landlords and a little bit of other things. And I wonder what that does to psychology when actually it's such a battleground even to have ownership of land, and you know, the drive for ownership is not a selfish, self-indulgent thing. It's about how do you steward and hand something over or leave something that is then, you know, in the commons or in the public good, as opposed to just consistently remaining within the same group of, you know, essentially in this country, landlords and property developers. I'm interested in two things from what you've said, Mark. One is, so you talked about the economy being largely focused on tourism. 20% on tourism. What impact has COVID had on that? And secondly, given that, and like, what have you seen? Like, have you been seeing new green shoots, or has it been an absolute disaster for the area? And also, given that you have assets, you know, what's the long-term plan on that for you the other way, like where you're, you know, what are you thinking about that? How will that go forward? And what's your
Soraya can speak to COVID in tourism and the amazing job Tunisia did managing COVID with, I believe it's still less than 100 deaths in the last 3 months, which either gets chalked up always as to, oh, they just didn't test right, or those numbers couldn't be right, versus it doesn't always require high wealth to manage response well if you put people first. Which
again, it's I like to emphasize that, because yeah, we absolutely like had the great management of the crisis, and the results are stunning, like less than 100 deaths. And today we have 47 active cases, I think. And overall, we had less than 1,300 cases, I think, or for sure less than 1,500. And we're 12 million. So we're not in a village. Like, it's a nation that was successful in managing the crisis. And for that, we're very proud. It's just when you read the articles, it's like, oh, by chance, by genetics, by whatever. But I believe that we were able to successfully manage the crisis because of the policies and the structural changes that were implemented in Tunisia that I mentioned, and the new government and how they're working in collaboration with great experts and people who actually are doing the work. There was a shift in exports because we have a lot of companies in Tunisia that settle in Tunisia but produce exclusively for exports. So all medical equipment, all masks, everything that was produced in Tunisia, the government obliged the companies to leave it in Tunisia. So we had everything we needed. Like we could just produce like every equipment we needed because the companies are here. We don't need to ask another country to buy from. And then the land relationship, like I mentioned, like we each have relationship to farms. There is no distanciation from farm. Food can easily be transported within the same region for the same region. It's feasible. It's easy, and then now with the tourism, nobody wants tourists to come back. The whole sector is affected. People have lost their jobs, the taxi drivers, everything. But now that we have no problem and everything is outside cases, nobody wants tourists. There was Mark in the taxi earlier, and the taxi driver said, did he just make it to the country? No, because where they're from, they have the sickness. And we don't have it here. So even though tourism was affected, businesses, as soon as it reopened, everybody was everywhere. And the cafes and the restaurants and people planning vacations. So now the government planning for tourists to come back, and people are not very happy about it.
I'll jump in before Indy and Mark have something to say. Please do carry on. But just on that, Soraya, I have to say, from a colonial legacy point of view, I mean, I am just over the moon that England and Britain is getting a taste of its own medicine, because people don't want us, and you know, we had a long history of going, you know, to other places and infecting them and pillaging them and stealing and introducing new illnesses, especially in indigenous lands. And I just feel like, you know what, as much as it will affect me and it's very disappointing, and Indy would definitely say this is not a very mature comment, I just feel like in the cycle of spiritual life, right, we absolutely are going to get an ass whooping, because we did that unregulated before, and now people are noticing, right? And so there's something about what you said that I really like, because it's like everyday people can now say, no, you can't come over here and give us your illness in a country where you haven't valued your people, you haven't dealt with it quickly, you haven't looked after, like this on a meta level is really brilliant. And I know I'm part of those people because I was born here, but we went around unaccountable for many decades, and then the ongoing impacts of that, spreading disease, stealing resource, and we're unaccountable. And it's not that I want the governments to hold us accountable. I like that the taxi driver is saying, hey, no way. We don't want your people because we don't think you've dealt with it well. And there is something connected to how we as a political system have dealt with it that's particularly grotesque as well. It hasn't leaned into like the beautiful and cultural histories of other places where they've worked together. We talked to people from New Zealand on, I think, the second day, and hearing them talk about how proud they were and how grateful they were for the way their country has dealt with it is something here in the UK that would be completely alien for people to say, yeah, I'm really proud of our government. We haven't been able to say that for a long time. Well, a lot of us haven't. And so why I just want to say that is because I do think this is linked to what you've just said about human development, right? And there's something about there's something beautiful about the fact that it isn't just your prime minister or your leaders or, you know, people with positions of authority saying it's the taxi driver who's decided for themselves, I suddenly understand, you know, how these interdependent systems work. And if your country hasn't worked in unity with others, then yeah, we don't want your people coming and ruining the hard work that we've all put in here to try and hold this. There's something powerful about that, and I just want to kind of put it out there. But yeah, I'm going to hand back over to Mark, who I'm sure has got some more stuff to say. We can take some questions in a little while, so do keep them coming.
Yeah.
But just quickly, sorry, I just want to make a short comment. It's so powerful in shifting those dynamics of colonial mindset, because 4 months ago, nobody would say New York is less safe than Sousse. And it's interesting that, for example, some people were, before coming to Tunisia, they have this apprehension that for some reason we are less safe of a country because we're African, because we speak Arabic, because there is history of colonial violence, that we are less safe. And nowadays, medically, we are way more safe. And here, if you get sick in Tunisia, you will find a doctor. If you have COVID, you will find a respiratory equipment. If you get sick in Paris or New York, that might not be the case. And for a lot of people, it's not the case. And so it's very humbling, I hope, for these nations that think that they have the answer to everything. But I'm not going to dream too much. But at this
So I want to go back to your first question on tourism, Emmy, and then I want to tie some of the questions that are being asked, Rika's and Fred, who's a good friend from Pittsburgh, and then the last one on the funding streams, which is if tourism is 20% of the GDP, and people are wondering how that is affecting the national economy in Tunisia. The short answer is it's immensely. The correct answer is immensely, and it's not surprising considering how the country had already taken out IMF loans post Ben Ali as a way of trying to do a kind of structural reinforcement of the country into privatization in new ways. The ways that they were doing that were deepening the investments into tourism. And the conversations we had here were similar to, I'm sure, that Indy's had, which is we know that tourism is changing globally. And we also know that economy is changing globally. Prior to COVID, the statistic was that 40% of all jobs would be lost to automation within the next 15 years. And kind of the tongue-in-cheek humor is, and we didn't expect it to be 15 weeks versus 15 years, which is the moment we're at now, which is pretty much everyone fully onboarding to digital and automation. We had tried to make some cases to some groups here around that scale of change that was coming and the need to make new investments into emerging economies, into youth, into new relationships, into kind of digital analog hybrid, and people were slow to respond because the philanthropy sector and the VC sector has a set way of doing things that doesn't, in my opinion, doesn't work well for our modern era, and isn't actually, it's not fit for the world to come either. And so we're trying to find those ways. And I think part of that way, it goes back to Indy's statement of like our global relationships. And so Fred Brown, who's put some questions here talking about how do we create bridges between systems? And when he's talking about the social determinants of health, Fred's based in Pittsburgh and is doing a lot of work from the Greater Pittsburgh Foundation and how to network the entire philanthropic sector of Eastern Pennsylvania to create more sustainable cities under the SDG goals. We've had conversations because Pittsburgh is mirroring a lot of the problems Sousse is mirroring, which to me is a lot of the problems Birmingham is mirroring, which are these kind of second to third largest cities within nations that aren't receiving spotlights, aren't receiving funds, and saying, okay, how can we network ourselves and create new trade routes, new kind of self or cycles of investment within each other? And how can those then help create better outcomes for our cities, both locally and as part of a network? For me, that's both how the tourism sector is now. It's a part of a larger economic problem of Tunisia. And then that's also then the springboard to, okay, now where are we going to go from here?
So I think that opens up some really interesting conversations. So I agree with you that I would say London. So the reality is, I don't think the future is going to be made in places like London. It's not able to convene. It's not able to deal. It's got so many legacy assets and lock-ins. Its politics is about preservation. It's not able to deal with the complexity of the transition that's coming. Whether the city itself is able to deal with the complexity of the transition that's coming is also questionable. I mean, so certainly the cities that are where, I've been involved in, so we're talking to big cities across the UK. And one of the big things is you recognize the urban central business district doesn't exist. Tourism, retail, hotels, all gone. Workspaces, 30%, 40%, all gone. So the central business district is no longer viable and is likely to be empty. So if we then start to look back out, where would and we know the work is being displaced into people's homes, it's being displaced globally, it's being displaced through automation. So the nature of the city in the 21st century and how we build relationships and complexity around that is going to be fundamentally different. The role of the house, the role of the private house, the role of the collective house, the role of private space, significantly higher. So I think we're seeing a fundamental transition in how human beings start to organize themselves and are able to organize social networks and value in really deep ways. And that will build a change as to where people go, where people live, where people choose to organize themselves. And I think, in a way, I would argue the hyper-local, the very local, will become very, very critical, as in your high street in your local area. Your infrastructure connection to the globe will become very, very critical. Now, the problem is that's fine for the kind of what I'd call the new globalized elite. But the reality is, simultaneously to all that conversation, we're going to see those taxi drivers lose their jobs. Those the people that are working in every tourist industry lose their jobs. So we're going to see the largest scale of global unemployment that we've seen in our world. And we know, like, food scarcity is already an issue. So when you start putting these factors together, the reality is that you look far enough without actual real structured transitions. I think we're looking at deep instability, right? I don't think there's any other way about it. We're looking at deep instability. So I have to admit, I mean, you know this as well, I have no schadenfreude about this. I think this is going to be trouble and big trouble. And if we ever get to some resolution, it'll be a complex resolution in the first place. So I have to admit, I think, yes, I think second order cities are really powerful. I think we do need new economies. We need new people are going to vote with their feet of how they choose to live, how they choose to exist in their society, how value is created. I think we have a structured transition coming. And in it centers human development, unless we can build the human development capacity of our citizens. And that's no longer about teaching them coding skills. It's actually fundamentally new capabilities to exist in a world of uncertainty. It's new human strength. It's new facilities to be able to learn and unlearn continuously. It's resilience at a structural level. That requires, and that's not just, the house has to be a place of learning as much as the park, as much as the street. Everything has to be turned into a place of human learning and development. So universal basic income for me is not about welfare distribution. It's not about wealth distribution. It's about building a shared platform to help everyone be an agent of discovery, to unleash their development capacity. So I think when we start to marry these things together, what we have to start to talk about is new micro kind of institutions of transformation. You know, what would happen if Birmingham turned around or Medina turned around and said, so we're going to be the first city to give a universal basic income. We're going to have a new social contract, which will be a new social contract of shared value and wealth sharing, intergenerational wealth sharing into the future, a new compact of that. How can we make extraordinary, I would say, para-institutional models to drive that? And I don't have any, I mean, much like you, Emandeep, I don't have any faith right now that governments are able to lead this. I think this might be new classes of trade unions, dense, you know, a new place-based unions of people, which are able to formally go into contract and create new types of relationship value between the current, but collective now, the individual now, and future nows. And in a way that...
Sorry, I was going to... Go on, carry on, and we can come back to it.
And in a way, what I see in the projects that you're doing is those realities. And we have to challenge people. I think the biggest problem we face is that our perception of self, our perception of being human, is so outdated. And it's not outdated as in, oh my God, it was perfect in history. It wasn't. Like, let's not romanticize it. Actually, there's a new restriction to be built, which is, I mean, so, you know, everyone talks about China or a sort of Indian model, which is a civilization model, where society is a sovereign entity. Or you can talk about the individual as a sovereign entity, or you can talk about the family as a sovereign entity, but they're all shit in different ways because they all create exclusions. They all create the other. You know, when you take the individual as sovereign, we make everyone else the other. If you take civilization as sovereign, then you make the minorities the other. If you make the family sovereign, then you get tribal infrastructures which make non-families other. We need a flip change of looking at interdependence in a fundamentally different way. That's a transition to, I think, anything we've all spoken about or been able to do.
If I a little bit, and I think that's underpins a lot of back-end conversations both Sarai and I have had, as well as others have had across the world. And it touches on what we were talking about yesterday, indeed, is that we're talking about more than a shift in identity and a shift in systems. We're talking about a shift in an epistemology and worldview. We are looking for a new way of being. And in that way of being, we have to identify the type of being, both, for me, always first, the being I want to be in relationship to myself, and what that self means, whether it's atomized, whether it's epigenetics, whether it's generation, time, space, etc., and then in relationship to where that extends. But I think then it's important to shout out John Powell's work from the Othering and Belonging Institute out of Berkeley, which is also now working in the UK. I think there's a belonging network they're looking at. But his question of, is there a way to build a sense of belonging that doesn't require othering? And for me, that always comes back to the worldview question, that it's absolutely yes. The only way that you build belonging that requires othering is if you subscribe to dialectics. That people across the planet have always had original technologies, if you will, for understanding the interconnectedness of all things. How do we apply them or repurpose them or build anew using them as inspiration, I think is one of the core questions of our time. And I would say that also that I think part of that question, though, and the answering that I think it's important, why I love the Civic Square and the New Medina as partners with one another versus clones, is because I think when we look for answers to question, we're looking for a circle to fit in a circle, instead of looking for wireframes to fix things ourselves in our local and regional perspective.
So Mark, just to build on that, I mean, so I totally agree with you about this kind of discovering what it means to be and become. Human becoming, I think, is a really important thing. I think really interesting question about belonging. And I would sort of, do you belong to your past? Do you belong to your place? Do you belong to the future? And do you belong to actually everything? right? And I put those challenges up there because I would say in quite a few religious texts, the thesis is God is everywhere, God is everything, i.e. a singularity, i.e. it is the singularity to which we belong. And the discovery of that singularity is, in many religious texts, is a kind of transcendence. Not all, but in many religious texts, it's a singularity belonging. In which case, I think the falsehood of belonging to place and the falsehood of belonging to people is actually challengeable. And I wonder whether we're able to build the consciousness to exist at that level, or are we stuck in a micro consciousness of trying to attach belonging to really fragile things which actually divide us? So I suppose somebody asked me, where do you belong? I belong to the future. That was my answer to get rid of the problem. But having thought about this, right, because I hate it. I hate the question. For me, I respect there's brilliant people out there thinking it, because I think you're dragged to it. Whereas actually, when I say I belong to the future, Mark, you too can belong to the future with me, right? Whereas my past, unfortunately, nobody can go back into history. So it's a singularity or possibility which I revel in. And I think in a world where we are increasingly being divided in many places, spatially in many formats, how can we transcend that? I think is a really interesting question. And I think to transcend it is not an easy issue, because we have to deal with the injustices that have been in play. So this is not a ignore issue. I think it's a transition issue. But we have to address the injustices. We have to recognize them. We have to deal with the traumas. But I think the goal has to be a new singularity, right? Not the techno singularity of California. Put that in quote.
I like to think of. It's okay.
No, go on, please go.
I just wanted to build up on this. And when you shared like your idea on belonging, and is it past, is it future, is it now, is it the place? For me, the first image that came to mind is an ecosystem. I don't think it's one directional or one dimensional. It's all of it. You know, I am part of the whole. At least for me, I'm speaking from my perspective. I am part of this ecosystem of belonging and being. And I like to think of it like that, you know?
I agree. I think we need better words to describe it. Better language. We need to give ourselves new tools of language to be able to describe it. You know, my passport still says I was born in Britain, I'm British. Right? We haven't, and I'm not saying I devolved that, but I think there's a new language and syntax and grammar required to exhibit this thesis. Right? We describe ourselves through multiplicities and pluralities, but those are proxies of the world that we're arguing, right, about. The reality is, you know, we're all born of stardust. We wouldn't exist without stars. We were born out of literal dust of stars that had to die for us to be born, right? So and somebody beautiful said to me, oh, a mountain is always there. I said, no, a mountain is just in flow, but it's in a flow over millions of years. Right? Even a mountain is an agent of becoming. It's not an object. It's just in flow over a time span that we think doesn't exist.
I just want to add on that piece of like language. You know, I certainly don't have the right language for what we're talking about, because some of the things we're talking about I don't often seek to explain in English language, right? Like I have faith and so many of the things that I can't figure out and can't put words to come through other ways of me figuring that out. But yesterday, and that's enough for me, right? Like that really is okay. Like I don't actually need answers more than that, and I'm being honest with that, because I just think this is a good space to like be honest with how we process this stuff. And some of the things about like who I belong to, where I come from, where I'm going, why I exist, why I am, be, do, comes through through being having the faith. But what I was going to say was yesterday we talked to an incredible lady called Diane Rusin from Winnipeg. I mentioned her earlier, and there was so much simplicity in how she talked about how you navigate so much of this, because her culture of Indigenous peoples believe that you're in relationship with multiple things, with people, the land, the trees. You're in relationship with everything, right? And the more you build those relationships and have that deep interconnection, the easier it is to understand so many other things, right? And I think like there's just something that comes out in everything that everyone's been saying that makes me think. We've talked a lot about like sovereignty and belonging and all of these things. So I'm just I think I just wanted to reflect on that. I'm going to just go through a couple of the questions, and then what I was going to say is, because we've gone over time a little bit, could everybody, which is absolutely fine because this is lovely, but could everybody kind of like have sort of their closing minute or two that they'd like to share about what do so we had this conversation, and so what, right? Like, what does that mean for us next, coming out of this time where things have changed so significantly, whether that be in a more safe or more dangerous way, just as we just talked about with the different impacts of COVID on our countries, but then the bigger picture of what's coming, you know, and so what's next, right? What do we need to believe in? What do we need to be doing? What do we need to be thinking about? And I was just there's one question that I thought was, we probably don't have time for all of them, but the one that I wanted to talk about, just because I know, Indy, you've been doing a bit of work with the UNDP, and I just wondered what you thought about this. Originally, Anand had said the land ownership issue is deeply connected to transport options. Humanity is moving to where transport infrastructure is historically, internationally, and within countries. Then he goes on to say, what India is describing, the nature of the city, is completely different in less industrialized countries. I'm in Nairobi, and better transport options could allow us to skip the hyper concentration of cities that are driving urbanization discussions right now. I just wondered whether you had any reflections on that. It's okay if you didn't. I just wanted to.
I think the thesis of transportation is going to get challenged. I think our mobility thinking and kind of the whole idea of scale of cities and the role. I mean, there are really well enough, but I know, like for example, in sort of Saharan African cities and going further down, there's a real question that where the growth of cities is largely a consumer city. It's driven by the capacity for consumption. It's not driven by it's the kind of those urban centers are not the production cities. They're not the histories of production. They're the histories of consumption, where the rich elite live and they consume and they create the spillover economies. Whereas actually the producer cities are all around the peripheries and actually growing really rapidly, but no one talks about them. And they are, whether they're resource orientated, high craft economy cities. So there is some really, it's a very big question, and it all has implications. The question is, are we going to focus everything on human transportation? I doubt it. I doubt that's the thesis of value creation. I think we will have human face-to-face interactions. They will be really important, but they'll be very high-value transactions. We will move them to being high-value transactions. And that's going to be one of the big challenges I think we face, is that we're going to have multimodal. Like, if you ask me now, I was to go to a 3-day person travel, I would travel for a 3-day deep, intensive conversation and exploration. I wouldn't travel for a meeting. I wouldn't travel for an hour or 2 long event. I just wouldn't do it. It's a waste of time and effort. So the reality is, I think the respect for human-to-human interaction will go higher. And we know, like, face-to-face interaction is 80%, communication is much richer. So I think we're going to have a completely different model emerging. And I don't know Nairobi well enough to make particular cases, but I think Mark probably does. But I do reckon at a structural level, we're going to see quite different travel structures coming about.
Thank you. Okay. I was just a funny note. I was going to say it's hard enough to get Indy in a room as it is, and now he's just added another layer of barriers. That's what he's going to travel for. So I look forward to seeing the future in Indy's world, and how people get him to leave the house or leave the screen. But it's been really lovely to have this conversation with you all, and for all of you that have stayed just listening to us have this really open conversation. I would encourage everyone to check out the new Medina, the work that Mark and Soraya are doing. Mark's got a lot of work on Department of the Future and many books, and we've put it all in the blurb. And I encourage you to follow him on Twitter and all of that, because there's so many great things that we could have talked about today. I'm just grateful that we've had this just open conversation between the four of us who are all doing similar and very different work. But to finish off, what I would like to kind of do is leave you with a minute or two from each of you. And I think, Soraya, it'd be really nice if you go first, and then we just layer it on. You know, what are you thinking? What do we need to be focusing on? What does the future hold? How do we build it and not be victim to it? What are your main thoughts? And then just feel free to go around.
So, as you left with the question, where do we go from here? And what do we do after this conversation? For me, it's very practical idea, like on how we can, you know, inspire from the models of development here and what works without the noise that's present in other locations. And at the same time, there's an opportunity for new development and conscious and value-driven development and urban development and investment. And as Tunisia opens up to foreign investment, and what does it look like if it's done right from the beginning? Now it's French investors and investors from other countries, but what does it look like if we actually invested with the values from the beginning? How can you influence a place that's not going from so far? You know, the muscle is not stretched as much as it is in other places. So I'd be very interested in seeing what could that look like.
Shall I go first, and then Mark, maybe you get the last word? For me, it's about how we take this philosophy of human development and becoming, and make it hyper particular, i.e., how do we make it at the experience of somebody walking in to a place and being in that place, and what are the small things that we have to do and change? One of my extraordinary moments was small things like, do you cut the cake that people can eat with their tea, or do you let them cut it themselves? Like all the experiences of, do you commodify things to the point of every cake slice or every cup of coffee, or do you live in a world of generosity, and how does that operationalize itself? So I'm really interested in how we can take these big concepts that we've been discussing and then manifest them in the hyper particular that extend everyone to being that person that we're talking about. Because I think we have to make that cultural transition for all of us. And that's what you guys control in a way as well. You control those, or you influence those everyday behaviors. Mark, to you, my friend.
I think for me, at the core of everything we're engaging is, how do we begin recalibrating our idea of what is wisdom and who has wisdom? And I think from those two questions, we start to find answers or new compasses to every question and design challenge we're facing. So, you know, and Fred's point of the crisis of trust or trust deficit, and how do we move beyond the theoretical to the metaphysical? I think we forget that metaphysics literally just means the first origin or the first causes of all things. And that's one of the things that I really believe that we're missing, which is going back before we go forward. And so I think that will lead to a lot of things. One thing I would also like to kind of leave the audience with is the challenge of of humanity at this moment really about designing and defining the future of work? Or is it better allocated saying, if robots and automation can take up the tasks that filled human life over the next 500 years, and now we have 14 to 18 hours a day that don't have to be dedicated to things that most of us would not want to do, maybe it's better set asking about the future of purpose and human beings not having to work. And so these are the types of questions that I'd really like to see in people engage.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to share anything else?
You.
I'll leave my bit. I am. Look, I think that we have to. I think we have to opt in to the future. I think we have to wake up every day and make the choice to do this work, because I have loved every moment of the work that I've been doing. But as I've started to understand how much, like you said, we're wasting so much time with things that we don't want to be doing, that so much of the last couple of years of it became a moment where I thought, no, I need to step away from this. I can't handle the dismantling of a system that we're trying to do whilst trying to build the future. So we're trying to build an example of tomorrow today, and we're trying to work within existing structures that aren't set up to help humans to thrive. And so I think what I have really been thinking about is, what does it mean to wake up every day and make the part of the work that you're doing, or the work that you're doing, a choice, opting in, a choice to build the future, so that, probably in response to Roman's Snarik's provocation yesterday, so that my friends' grandchildren can wake up and have the life that Mark is talking about, full of purpose and full of public squares and empathy and care and connection, and are in relationship with everything around them in such a beautiful way that we've all talked about. Because actually, I think that we all can get close to it, as close as we individually can to it. But I do think that if I live believing that this world that we're talking about is coming tomorrow, or the next day, or next year, my life is full with constant disappointment. And I feel like we're living in transition, right? We're living in transition. So we are the stewards. And within this time, we have to find the ways to be well, and to love, and to be loved, and to care, and to be in relationship with many things, and to fight for the future. But I have to do that waking up every day knowing that it might be a whole lifetime of transition, and it might be your children, or it might be their children, that see the fruits of that. And so that's what and I'm not saying this in a pessimistic way, because lots of people know that I'm very optimistic. But I think when you can wake up and choose that every day, it becomes, you can work in a longer timeline. And I certainly haven't been able to choose that. I've been grappling and struggling and fighting for a bit in the middle, as I started to realize how hard this work is in this last decade. And now I think I'm coming out of that. I think I've grounded in a much deeper way about what's the point of all of this. So hopefully your 2.5-year-old and your 5-year-old, who speak all those languages and belong to many things, will have a glimpse of this future. And I think that's worth it. And I think that's why we're not a glimpse. Hopefully they'll bask in this future. And then that's why I think it's worth all of us being in community with each other. And I want to finish off by saying, Fred talks about, so how do we address the lack of human exchanges that are necessary to build deep trust? How do we move? I understand that. And I understand that we do need to be in proximity. I'm someone who really, really needs that. But I do think that this conversation and the fact that Mark and I haven't seen each other for a couple of years now, I think, or a year at least. But I can think the reason why I'm doing my work, because he tells me the story of his 2.5-year-old, and why I think it's worth that is part of what we need to do. And so I don't think it's just a miserable story of we'll all be staring into our screens. We'll find a way for how this happens. But I think you have to get up and you have to choose to build a future you might not experience the full basking sunlight of, because actually probably that's one of the only ways to get through it. And then my less existential dread side of it would say, and through that you need to find as much joy and care and connection and empathy through the things that we've all talked about, right? Being in relationship with many things, not just how quickly we can get back out to the shops or how quickly we can go on our cheap flight to Tunisia and spread coronavirus there. Do you know what I mean? These are the things, right? Talking to you is so different to what you hear the tourism industry talk about, and people who are frustrated that people don't want Brits in their country. And this is why, because taxi drivers and residents of where you live are like, yeah, but we're doing okay. We don't want to be ravaged by this like you were. And yeah, that matters to me. So I think choose to get up every day and build the future is what I would say, and don't expect that you'll bask in the sunlight of it, because it might not be yours to do. So thank you. That's been lovely.
Thank you.
It's been beautiful. And well, on that note, what I'm going to close with is to say lots of love to you all. And as we go into another uncertain time, I hope that you guys stay safe and well, and your country stays safe and well. And I mean that not in a jokey way. I mean that genuinely. I hope that you really continue to build what you're building, and that you stay in this maintenance recovery, and small amount of proportional deaths, even though every death is tragic for every family. Yeah, I wish you a lot of love, and we'll see you all, right, whoever's in the chat and wherever you are soon, because we've got to build this work. And I really look forward one day to making that worthwhile visit that Indy talks about to the new Medina.
Absolutely. Everyone, Ellen was everyone is welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye, everyone.